thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to chair this evening's necessary event with an inspiring range of speakers. As you may know, the Labour Party has opened its consultation on policy via the National Policy Forum. The Cosmos is running a series of events to discuss how members can make submissions to defend and develop a manifesto based on our socialist values. This evening is our last event in this series, but we have an excellent range of speakers covering a lot of issues. And we're covering the themes of our commissions relating to early years education and skills, and of course, justice and home affairs. The topics cover so many of the inspiring, radical, necessary policies which the Labour Party has developed over the last 5 years under our inspirational leader, then Jeremy Corbyn. And so our opportunity to hold on to some of those policies is here in our hands today. We have so many fantastic policies which need defending and expanding. And it's actually up to all of us to fight for this future within the Labour Party. And events such as these are crucial in that struggle. Before we begin, I must give a special shout out to some of our guest speakers this evening. I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by Richard Burgon MP, who was Shadow Secretary of State for Justice under Jeremy Corbyn. And he has risen to become one of the most powerful voices, I believe, on the left in recent years. His inspiring run for deputy leadership focused on the need for a member-led Labour Party democracy, which basically safeguards our socialist policies. I also want to give a big shout out to Ribeiro Addy, the MP for Streatham, who's joining us this evening. Bell was elected, like me, in 2019 and quickly became a shadow immigration minister under Jeremy Corbyn. Before being elected, she was chief of staff to Diane Abbott and helped orchestrate the anti-racist fight and taking that to the Tories during Diane's time as Shadow Home Secretary. I'm also looking forward to hearing from Baroness Christine Blower. Now, as a former General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, she is distinguished. Well, let me put it this way. She's a distinguished veteran of the trade union movement and an expert on education policy. Christine is also Vice Chair of Unite Against Fascism. And I'm delighted that we've got such an inspiring range of speakers this evening. And in recent weeks, we've heard why it's crucial for the Labour Party members to engage wholeheartedly with the National Policy Forum. We've really got no time to lose. So I look forward to hearing from tonight's excellent speakers. And I wanted to open by taking us to our first speaker, which of course is Baroness Christine Blower. So over to you, Christine.
Claudia, thank you very much for that really interesting opening, and I'm delighted to be able to join you this evening. I'm just going to enter a few caveats, which are these. I'm not on the Policy Forum. I'm not on any of the commissions. So what I'm going to say about policy this evening is partly to reinforce all of the really brilliant policies that we had in 2019, and also to talk about how I think we can develop them and move them from where they were in, as you say, Claudia, in a socialist direction. Well, of course, there were very many very good proposals in 2019, and if we begin with early years, I think in a few short paragraphs, the manifesto encompassed everything that needed to be said about early years, with the single exception of the necessity to talk about the curriculum, but I will come on to that later. My own view of where policy needs to be is that we've got a national health service, we've absolutely got to have a national education service, and we need a national care service. And I think that, in a way, is a different way of talking about cradle to grave. It's born in the NHS, teaching and learning in the National Education Service, and then cared for, you know, both in difficult times and also in old age with dignity through the National Care Service. So we can see how a Labour government with those policies could really genuinely be all things to all people in a very good way. But if I just start by saying that I think the early years aspect of the manifesto was, as I say, reasonably well worked out. But I'm going to focus my remarks, I think, on the school bit. And let me say, first of all, about the very good policies that were in there. Those of you who can remember as long ago as when Tony Blair was leader, he had this ridiculous notion of standards, not structures. And that government, led by Tony Blair, went on to create more structures and different types of schools in the education system than we had ever had before. And of course, we knew that there were going to be problems with those policies when it was that the Tories were saying, oh yes, this is policy with which we can work. So it was excellent that in the 2019 manifesto, there was talk of all schools enjoying common employment arrangements and national pay arrangements for teachers and for other workers in education. And of course, elsewhere, Laura Pidcock, who was then, of course, an MP, was leading the work on collective bargaining, so that we would have been back in the position where teachers actually knew where they were, rather than this system of having so many different types of schools. And of course, all schools under the way we would be looking at it would be following essentially the same rules, and it says that in the manifesto, and all would be part of the local accountability arrangements through reinvigorated local authorities, the democratic structure in which all can participate. Now, that affords so many really interesting things for teachers, for people who are teachers and who are other types of education workers. It means that teachers can actually engage in peer activities across schools. One of the things that's crept into education, it's in higher education, but it's also creeping into school education, is this notion of intellectual property rights. You know, there are academy trusts where if you write a worksheet on the academy trust time, i.e. during your working time, somehow or other they assume that they have the intellectual property rights to that. And this is because education has gone in entirely the wrong direction of not thinking about, you know, everybody wanting to work together for the good of all of the children working there, but working together across schools in the way that we did, again, as it says in the manifesto, through the very, very successful London Challenge. All of these existing policies could really mean that teachers are much better, they're in a much better employment situation, but also they're able to work together in a much more collaborative fashion. Now, one of the things that the manifesto was a little bit light on was the kind of next area that I particularly want to just give some attention to, which is the curriculum and assessment. And I must say, that is a particular area and interest of mine. For a long time now, when I talk about the curriculum in particular, I have been borrowing from, it was something that was done by progressive teachers in the United States, although they meant something different by it. But the expression is that the curriculum should be a mirror and a window. So when you look at the curriculum, when anyone looks at the curriculum, because it's a mirror, they should be able to see themselves in the curriculum. They see that what they're learning about has a resonance for them and their own lives. But it's also a window through which they can look and see very many other different kinds of things. Now, it seems to me that what we need in order to be able to develop a curriculum that actually is like that, that does reflect that, is that we need something which I'm calling a National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. I'm going to come on to assessment, but curriculum and assessment obviously go together. And it seems to me a national council would be something that would not be a government department. It would be comprised of teachers through their unions, but also parents and carers, people who choose to be governors through local authorities, possibly academics, very importantly, community leaders of various kinds, and students themselves. It's absolutely critical that there is a student voice in the development of curriculum. And of course, you know, it may be felt that we should also have the voice of business at some stage, not with a dominant voice, but with a voice that says, you know, there are things, particularly later on and higher up the education system in FE, when we're looking at skills development, where the voice of business should at least have a place. So a national council for curriculum and assessment would be responsible for curriculum design and curriculum content. And so obviously at the moment there's a huge amount of discussion about Black Lives Matter and about how we cannot simply just, you know, when we get back to schools eventually in September or whenever it is, we cannot just assume that the curriculum will be exactly as it has been hitherto. I mean, one of the things that colleagues who've heard me speak before will know that I've said on a number of occasions is, you know, Black History Month, fabulous. Lots of people do fabulous stuff in Black History Month. But what about the other 11 months? And what about all of the other aspects of Black lives that are completely absent from the curriculum? So if we had a national council for the curriculum, we could actually hear those voices in curriculum design. And I think that is, frankly, absolutely critical. Now, it's true that the manifesto in 2019 did talk about an arts premium for arts education. It talked about Black history. It talked about learning about the Holocaust. It talked about the science of climate and the environment and those emergencies and how we deal with them. These are all really good ideas, but they mustn't be individual bits. We have to look at the curriculum holistically, and I think that it's absolutely essential that looking further forward, we actually gather all those ideas about what the curriculum might be like. And if it is going to be a mirror and a window, we definitely need as many perspectives as we can get. Now, if we move just briefly to the question of assessment, I think it's intriguing that Nick Gibb, the schools minister, stood up, I think in the House of Commons, but he may have said it somewhere else, and said, doesn't really matter that Key Stage 2 SATs aren't happening this year, because actually they're about testing schools. I mean, you know, we've all known that for a very, very long time. But he said it in a way to try and assuage the anger of parents who thought it was a terrible thing that their kids would miss Key Stage 2 SATs. Now, we know that Jeremy came to the NEU conference and said that Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 SATs would go. And with Nick Gibbs saying they're just really about testing schools, I think here is a really, a really clear reason why we should not have that. Because we all know, those of us who are teachers and probably plenty of people who are parents know, that if you have this very rigid system of testing children, then you get the backwash effect, which is that most of the teaching is about the things that are going to be tested. They're not about the generality of life and the things that are important. And then we look at the exams that we have at 16 plus. Now again, those are not happening this year. And there are issues about why we would have a blanket, more or less blanket exam for children at 16 plus, young people at 16 plus, when actually we don't expect them to be leaving school, because we expect them to be staying in school. So why not rethink that whole question of assessment at 16 plus? Do we need it at all? If we do, why do we spend so much money on having it as an external examination system? Why not think about something which might be based more on teacher assessment? Although at this point, I enter the caveat that many teachers have been utterly de-skilled in the kind of interesting assessment that we think is important. And of course, it's absolutely true that there will be teachers with unconscious bias. Most of us have unconscious bias. And so if we're going to have more teacher assessment, then it has to be that we work on making sure that teachers are training themselves into how to do that, and that students engage with that kind of assessment themselves. And then when we get to A-level, well, actually, we probably do need some kind of exam at 18, although not all kids are doing A-level by any means. But actually, the revision of what is done at the end of formal schooling, there was a perfectly good report from Tomlinson years ago when we still had the Blair government, looking at how we could assess children or young people right at the end of their school career. And I commend it to you. People can still find it, and it would need updating, but it's a really interesting thing to be looking at. Now, one of the other things that I think is absolutely critical for kids at all ages is partly that they need a curriculum, certainly in the early years and in primary, not based entirely on, but which has a very big input of play, because we all know the importance of play. I can tell you, I was once going to make a speech at the NUT conference, and I Googled adult play. I won't tell you what I got for that, but if we look at the kind of play that we have in the early years and look at the way that really helps with child development, we need to be looking at that into the primary years. And then once we look into the secondary years, I think it's really important that we are having a read across from whatever our department for culture, media and sport might be, to look at how we can make sure that kids really have a genuine access to sporting activities at all levels and in all different kinds of types of sport. And of course, critical, there has to be a big input of, what is broadly called culture into schools. There should, for example, be an entitlement that every child at least once a year is taken to some kind of cultural event. It may be the theatre, it may be a concert hall, it may be something, and I'm talking about local here. I'm not talking about children being brought down from West Yorkshire to go to the West End in London. I'm talking about engaging with all of the cultural settings that there are locally. I think it's absolutely vital that we have all that available to children, and it's seen as an entitlement. Now, what that means is that we really have to think about how much time we spend on the things that we do at the moment. I'm going to say two final things. I think that's probably my time up, Claudia, but you can indicate whether it is or not. One is that the whole kind of post-16, or actually in Tomlinson it was post-14 area of education, has not necessarily been well funded. So skills development is not something that we've, it's been deliberately underfunded over the last certainly decade by successive governments. And it is really important that we keep different pathways open for different types of young people. And also that there's not a pathway that ever ends in a dead end. One of the things that the Finnish system in Finland, the system in Finland prides itself on, is that wherever young people take themselves, they will never end up at a dead end. It's always possible to move across into a different setting if they change their minds and decide that something, they've taken perhaps a slightly wrong turn and they want to do something different. So I'm not going to say much about higher education, although I have to say that I think that a national council for the curriculum in higher and further education is also an important matter, and how that would be assessed. All the critical points about higher education were, of course, made in the previous manifesto of abolition of fees and so on, and it will be really interesting post-coronavirus to see how our institutions of higher education are going to manage. But again, I think we do seriously have to look at what it is that's being taught and what the range of realistic options is for our young people in universities and in other places of learning, and indeed how they can learn in workplaces, because clearly the apprenticeship levy has not resulted in people having, you know, much better quality of apprenticeships. But those are an important part of, I mean, for me, they're an important part of the National Education Service. So I think I may be coming close to the end of my time. I would say that the significant issue that was missing from the manifesto was this issue about who and how the curriculum and assessment works. And I would like to see that feature very largely in how we talk about education going forward. Thank you very much, Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. That was absolutely brilliant. The way in which you've outlined there for us all the importance of a national council for curriculum and development, and obviously the ability to ensure that we have schools that provide a holistic curriculum that provides both learning and opportunities, and that's fantastic. And of course, raising the very important question there about what about those other 11 months. I think it's been absolutely brilliant that you were actually nominated for a life peerage in 2019. One of the most, if we're going to have anybody in the House of Lords, then we ought to have you, because in a sense, what you've brought, what you're able to bring to the table is significant. And for those who are asking, let me just put on the record that, of course, Christine is Baroness Blower of Starch Green in the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, for those that want that piece of detail. But we've got a number of questions, Christine. I don't know if you don't mind just addressing some of those questions. I've got George, for example, who wants, he talks about, we want votes at 16. Will we teach students about the importance of participation? And then whilst you're looking at that one, there's Sophia who's asking, how can we ensure that the national curriculum, your new national, I guess, National Council for Curriculum and Development, or even the curriculum as we've got it now, how can we ensure that it's recolonized and it is across all areas, and not just Black History Month? I think that is the question being posed. Okay, do you want to go with those?
Yeah, by all means. I'm absolutely sold on votes at 16, and interestingly, so is my union, the National Education Union. It's policy that we should have votes at 16, and after all, they did have votes at 16 in Scotland, of course. So within the islands of the United Kingdom, votes at 16 have already happened. The thing is, of course, that you wouldn't want to wait till someone was, 14 or 15 or 16 before you started talking about these things. I mean, the way that I would see the curriculum developing would have what we call student voice. People mean different things by it, but people, children as young as 7, 8, 9, being able to talk about how they feel about their own learning and engaging with their own learning and engaging with the institution and engaging with their teachers. That's about participation. So you have to start with participation contextually, in a context that children, young people understand. That's what we might call age appropriate. We need them to be in school councils, we need them to be in class councils, we need them to be doing all of those things so that they understand that democracy is about participation. And also that if there are people who are excluded, then that's not democracy. So it seems to me that it's not by having a lesson that says, this is what democracy looks like and this is what voting does. That's not how we should be doing it. We should be doing it by active learning and active participation. And I think that schools have the capacity to build all of those kinds of things, as well, of course, as local authorities through young people's parliaments and all of those kinds of things, which need to actually actively engage with the school. So I absolutely assure you that votes at 16 and ways of making sure that we're building a kind of participatory democracy through our institutions is quite right. I mean, in terms of, so I would say the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment is not the it's not the plaything of government. It actually should be something that is genuinely democratic. So I would see elections to it from unions. I would see elections to it from parents' organisations. I would see communities making decisions about how they want to be represented on it. I would see young people coming through various youth organisations and so on. And if it's that, then it has all of the voices who need to be there in order to make those decisions. And that, you know, if we had that, then we wouldn't need Black History Month, however great it is. That people do fantastic stuff. I'm not saying they don't do fantastic stuff, but we wouldn't need it because we wouldn't have it absent from all of the rest of the time. Now, we can't get to that in September. I mean, of course we can't get to it in September. We've got a Tory government. They're not going to set this thing up. But what we can do in September is be much more active through our unions and in parents groups and so on, and say, you know, really, children have a right to know more about themselves. I mean, whether they're Black children, whether they're white children, whether they're, you know, BME, whoever they are, if they're gay, they have a right to know more about themselves. And that's why if we bring the principle of the curriculum being a mirror and a window to what we do, we can pick through the bits of the national curriculum. We can do those bits which we absolutely need to do, but we can add on all of the other flexibilities which the curriculum does afford if we do it in the right way.
Brilliant. And I don't know whether you wanted to say anything more about Black History Month and about that aspect as well, because I know it was mentioned that you mentioned about it not being just about 11 months, but yeah, obviously the notion of decolonizing the curriculum.
Yeah. I mean, I noticed it. What flashed up there at a moment ago was what about saying something about academies. Now I mean, I think we know, those of us who know a lot about education, know that there are academies where they simply exclude ridiculously high numbers of children, and a lot of children and young people who are excluded from school are Black children. So we do have to deal with the issue of these different types of schools and what they're doing. But I kind of slightly covered that, although I did it very quickly at the beginning by saying it's already Labour Party policy, was Labour Party policy in 2019, that we would move back to all schools being governed in the same way within a reinvigorated local authority. So, you know, there are some academies doing a halfway decent job. There are some academies doing terrible things. There is a real, I mean, I'm not going to presume that I'm the best person to say how we design the curriculum in order to make sure that it responds to all of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, wants. But it is, someone just flashed up there that the NEU is working on decolonising the curriculum. Daniel Kebede, who is one of our national executive members, is calling together people to talk about it, and we have policy on it. I mean, you know, the problem is that there's been some very decent but slightly, you know, I suppose patronising people who have said, well, you know, we do that in October, you know, we don't need to do it any of the rest of the time. And, you know, there's been that whole kind of thing about, you know, well, we do a little bit of this, you know, we do a bit of reggae, we do a bit of, you know, something or other. That isn't what we need. We need a root and branch curriculum. And that means that we have to challenge ourselves about what we've done. And one of the problems that we've got in addressing this is that there are very, very many teachers teaching now, you know, who are probably very, very good practitioners. I have no complaint about them, but they have become teachers in a period when there has been no anti-racism, there's been no anti-fascism, there's been none of that in the curriculum that they were taught in order to become teachers. So one of the other things that I do is I'm vice president of Show Racism the Red Card, and the NEU provides money to Show Racism the Red Card so that Show Racism the Red Cards education workers can work with teachers in training, all teachers in training in Wales. So they get, I mean, they don't get much, they get a couple of days, but they get a couple of days looking at what anti-racist teaching looks like. But there'll be thousands and thousands of teachers in our schools who simply have never had that. So we're starting from a base of needing to say to people, it's no good just to say racism is bad. You have to be actively anti-racist, and you have to think about what that looks like in your practice. And, you know, it will be a lot of work, but it's work that we absolutely have to do. Okay,
I've got a few more questions, but maybe I'll come back to you, Christine, on
Sure.
some of those questions later in the session today.
Sure.
But I want to just introduce our next speaker, and our next speaker, as I said right at the beginning, has been an inspirational activist, really, newly elected MP alongside myself, 6 months now, I think, a member of Parliament, but the Member of Parliament for Streatham. Over to you, Belle.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Obviously, I was really, really pleased to be elected the Member of Parliament for Streatham, my home, my entire life. But just before that, it was the privilege of my life to be able to work as Chief of Staff and Political Advisor to Diane Abbott MP, who was at the time the Shadow Home Secretary, and to help form what is, I believe, and then this isn't just because I was doing it, the best Home Office policy we've seen from a Labour Party in some time. I think it's always been very difficult with Home Office policy because there's always this desire, I think, to make it seem tough, to make it seem hard, and not think about how Home Office policy affects individuals' lives. It's often about rhetoric and not about people. And what is the office of the home if not about people? And I think it's really important that under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, we formulated a Home Office policy that was rooted in human rights. The idea that we would have policy that was not, that didn't have to be rooted in human rights because it was all about our protection, you know, didn't make any sense, because actually it always ends up working the other way. I think it's a massive mistake. It's outdated, it's expensive, it costs a human life. The cost of paying compensation for making so many mistakes, and then on top of that, finding that all of your policies are eventually a failure. So police that don't police by consent doesn't work. A fire service that isn't properly resourced doesn't work. A counter-terrorism bill that works against our communities instead of for our communities doesn't work. And an immigration policy that is inhumane and built on racism doesn't work either, because it eventually ends up not only destroying people's lives but destroying our economy. So, you know, talking on policing first, it was very important that we looked at all public sector workers and, you know, tried to get a situation where they were given that pay rise. That was central to our policy. And in terms of numbers, thinking about the fact that every single sector has been cut, and that put a lot of pressure on those individual resources. Now, I know some people weren't necessarily happy about that, but it's very, very clear that if we are to continue in this situation where we're talking about policing by consent, you know, the police would have to be properly resourced, but not just that, they'd have to be proper community police officers, not just the police officers that we see today who are so overstretched that they come across in a van, you know, when something goes wrong, sirens blazing, no, you know, real foot in the community, and everything's really hustle and bustle. That's not the way to police a community. And that's not right. But in the same breath, as well as supporting their need for greater resources, we had to, and always were consistent in, no matter whether, you know, it gained criticism, which it did, racist stop and search. You cannot police a community by consent if you come across as their oppressors. and not people that work for them. And I'm thinking particularly about Black communities who are, you know, over-policed as citizens and under-policed as victims. And that was something that definitely needed to change. And there are many different measures which the police should really have been taken to. And we were adamant on calling it out when we saw it, but also putting down very clear policy proposals as to how we should look at changing things. Proper training for police, creating a situation where they're not so overstretched, and making it clear, abundantly clear, with better recording and things such as that, that targeting specific communities is absolutely unacceptable. And one situation in which this has become major is in the policy on drugs. Now, at this point in time, we all know that our drugs policy isn't working. Over the past 10 years in particular, it's been ideological and plagued with cuts. So all of those resources that you would usually put into drug treatment has been cut down. So we are now the overdose capital of Europe. That's what the UK is now. It's simply not working. And I will say that the drugs issue is as much a social justice issue as it is a public health issue, because drug policy has been routinely used to discriminate against Black communities. And then we've seen again and again, you know, if you're a young Black boy in my area and you're caught with drugs, you will face harsh consequences. But if you admit to taking drugs as a member of parliament, you are more likely to end up in at the top of the leadership contest for the Conservative Party. And we know that there are drugs being used amongst, you know, bankers in the bars in this city again and again, and we've heard again and again how people are going to be tough on them. But there is such a disproportionate level of policing in terms of policing white people when it comes to drugs and Black people when it comes to drugs. Now, you don't have to be on either side. Now, there are many people that are very, very concerned about people overusing drugs, misusing drugs, and wanting drug levels, drug usage to go down. And there are some people that want it to be more liberalized. Whichever side you are on, it's clear that the policy we have at the moment is not working. And we've seen in other countries where you know, drug reforms have changed this. And it seems strange to say that either decriminalizing makes a difference, because it's like, oh gosh, it's a free-for-all. But evidence shows us that it might not necessarily be. And obviously we have to look at things in our country's context. And I think it's really, really important that first we call that discrimination in terms of the length of, well, actually the type of punishment that you are given if you are Black, or if you are white, if you are privileged, or if you are not. But also to look at the evidence so that we are making sure that we are saving lives. Now, it's very, very important. Well, no, it's the most important job of a government is to keep its citizens alive. And, you know, our drug policy isn't simply doing it. So in line with our route on policing, one of the policies was to call a royal commission on drugs. Now, it gets very political in terms of who supports it and who's not. So the idea was we would ask the experts. The experts would give us the answers, and that is what we would put. That is what we put down as a policy. No politics, no individual, you know, opinions in this. We'd be putting forward what the experts tell us to. And I think that is definitely the most sensible way to do it, because there is so much hypocrisy. I mean, the Labour Party were very active last year in particular in trying to make sure that medical marijuana or THC oil for young people, in particular children who have very, very serious seizures, was made legal. And still to this day, a number of those poor children in those situations are not getting the medication they need because they find it too often blocked by their doctors and by the Home Office. Yet, did you know that there is a legal marijuana farm in Norfolk? Now, the Home Office, whilst at the same breath having restricted you know, giving medical marijuana to young people that clearly needed it for seizures. People were having seizures like 30 times a day. They gave a license to a company called British Sugar, which also happens, the CEO also happens to be the partner of the minister who used to be responsible for drug policy. And they, with this farm, are allowed to grow medical marijuana and sell it to the US for a profit. Now, I don't get how it works with their taxes, because obviously it's not legal, so it's not clear what they would, what they would charge it under. But the hypocrisy around it was unbelievable. So a royal commission, we believe, would have made things more fair. Now, again, still sticking to the theme of policing, looking at counter-terrorism and the PREVENT program. Now, it's always been very difficult, because when it comes to issues of terrorism, people are very, very emotive, and the idea that anybody wanting to change certain anti-terror laws doesn't want to protect communities has always been one that's been bandied about, and it's always been unfair in terms of those that recognise the danger that some of these counter-terror policies can have. Now, as far as we were concerned, and as far as we could see, again, from evidence after evidence, the PREVENT program was not preventing anything. I mean, I look back to 2017, which, they dubbed the year of terror, of all the different terror attacks, the one in Parliament, the one in London Bridge, and in Manchester. And whilst the Muslim community is often demonized by the PREVENT program, what we realized when you actually broke it down is in at least 3 of those attacks, and I think there were about 5 that year, in 3 of those attacks, the police were notified and had previously been watching these individuals, and these individuals had been reported to them, not by a nosy neighbor that saw a lot of people coming around to visit them one day. They were reported to them by other members of the Muslim community who had seen that they were behaving strangely. And I think that's really important, because it's clear to show that whilst these programs seem to really, really target the Muslim community was actually willing to work with the authorities to help stop terrorism, but demonizing them in that way does not help. I remember the first encounter I had with this program when I was a student, and representatives at Bradford University. Now, these poor international students simply called home, and they found themselves, because apparently they said the wrong buzzword, in an issue with the police and needing the students' union to support them. It's absolutely disgraceful. And whilst people are, forcing their attention in another way, they're not looking at what's really leading to these issues. And a lot of the time, it just seems that PREVENT program money is used for things, and programs and organisations are taking it up to do social care, because they've cut a lot of social care funds. So people are literally taking this money and using it to do their usual work as they would with their community organisations, but just having to report a few people to be watched every once in a while. It became ridiculous. So we were very pleased in the last government to actually get them to get the government to put on the books a review of the PREVENT program. They are, however, in this new kind of revised version of the counter-terrorism bill, delaying it. And in line with Labour policy, I believe that we should absolutely be voting it down and fighting against it, because they promised us that review of PREVENT. It needs to be reviewed. It cannot continue as it is. Now, I just want to, because I'm probably running out of time, touch on fire before I touch on immigration, which has been a major policy. So we wanted to make sure that there were 3,000 extra firefighters. Now, we know that, again, across the years with austerity, fire services have lost their resources and lost their numbers. And actually, they removed certain responsibilities from them in terms of taking ownership of fire safety, which they really should have. And not just that, looking at things that should have been implemented. Now, before the Grenfell Tower fire, there was a fire not so deadly, but a similar fire in South London, in Lacknell House. Now, in Lacknell House, or Lacanau, was pronounced it wrong, after that fire, there was an inquiry and recommendations were put in place, which would have meant that the cladding on Grenfell Tower would never have gone up. And I remember the government at the time, I think it was under coalition government, they were all on a 3-line whip to come in and make sure that they voted down that legislation, because you know what, the majority of them are landlords themselves. And those measures would have put a lot of pressure on landlords in terms of making sure that they were meeting certain requirements, but not just in terms of cladding, but in terms of other things. And you know, it's this kind of, I like to call it selfish policy making, which usually meets the needs and the business interests of certain people in Parliament, which has led to so many tragedies and actually disparities in our society. So that's just a bit on fire. Now, just lastly on immigration, I think the change in immigration policy for the Labour Party was probably one of the most difficult things to do, and also one of the most amazing things for me personally to do, because having to watch over years, as you know, the party I vote for, the party I was a member of, saying some of the most ridiculous things on immigration in a hope to gain more votes, it just always broke my heart. And then to hear other activists saying, you know, you're supporting the Labour Party, but look at these horrible things that they're saying about immigration, and knowing that actually they were right. Some of the things that were being said were absolutely disgraceful, and for a socialist party to be descending into that rhetoric is absolutely, it was one of the things that I think as a younger person, other than student fees, which I'm sure somebody touched on earlier, really it made me take a while to actually join the Labour Party, because I was so disgusted with some of the things that were said. Now, it's looking at it from this way. There were, you know, there were a lot of rhetoric with the rise of far-right racism. People finding that they, you know, wanted to out-Tory the Tories, and as Diane always says, you cannot out-Tory the Tories, and we were doing a very bad job of it, as far as I'm concerned, you know, trying to put across that we're tough on immigration, British jobs for British workers, all of these strange things. And actually, do you know what? To our disgrace, some people from the left buying in on it in terms of jobs. Now we know that you know, immigrants do not drive down wages, and this is something that, you know, Diane and Jeremy always very clearly said. Immigrants do not drive down wages. Predatory employers and weakened trained union rights do. And if we tackle those two, we will tackle the scourge of low pay. Not just that, you know, people kept talking about, we need to go around the country, we need to speak to people, we need to listen to their concerns about immigration. I'm not one person that thinks we shouldn't listen to people's concerns, but that type of idea that we're going around, that we're listening to people, that we're you know, we have to hear what they have to say, and if they say anything horrible, we have to accept it, is just completely wrong. And actually, when you realize that you do go around and you do talk to people, and you know, when people come back and tell you what these people have said that may have some, what we may call backward views on immigration, do you know, it always goes back to certain things. It goes back to things like housing, it goes back to things like jobs, it goes back to things like education, sorry. It always goes back to things that people feel like they've been denied or they don't have enough of. I mean, there are some people, yes, who are absolutely racist, and that's clear, but people's biggest issues are not black and brown people on the streets. It's about what they do not have. And racist ideology sells them the idea that if these black or brown people were away from here, they would have better housing. If they were away, they would have better jobs. If they were away, they would have better education and opportunities. So actually, if we just fixed those issues, you'd find that people would have less of an issue with so-called migrants on the streets. And I think in all of these let's listen to people conversations, no one seemed to be picking up on that. So when we put together the immigration policy, we started from a place that we thought everybody would understand: family. Everybody understands family. Everybody understands that they want to be around their family and that families shouldn't be separated. And this is particularly at a time when the refugee crisis was at its height across Europe, and actually I wouldn't say was at its height. Just because the news cameras and everybody have kind of moved away from it doesn't mean that it's still not a very, very real issue. But we had an issue of family reunion, and particularly with Brexit coming, whether or not you are for it or against it, the idea that people should be separated and not be able to access what we like to call safe and legal routes, and Dublin 3 regulations that allow people to come in. Actually, Dubs, the Alf Dubs piece of legislation which we put down, which would allow unaccompanied migrants to come in and meet other members of their family here. So we started with that because we wanted people to understand that whereas people keep throwing out rhetoric about people taking resources, actually sometimes it's just about humanity, just about your right to a family life, your right to live freely with your family. And from there, you know, breaking down a lot of those things that I think people don't realize about the hostile environment. The hostile environment completely tore people apart with arbitrary targets, specifically on minimum income thresholds, you know, saying that your partner couldn't come and live with you if you didn't earn a certain amount of money, whilst keeping people's wages low, all of those things. And again, just the idea of the hostile environment, making sure that people felt extremely unwelcome. And we were going to do away with the entire 2014 and 2016 Act, all of those things that put those things in place. Because you know what, at the end of the day, people are talking about, again, drains on the economy and whatnot. Those immigration policies were some of the biggest drains on our economy ever. And if you're not a person that believes in humanity and you want to take it right down to the economy, it was not good for our economy. We were wasting money having to pay people compensation for putting them in ridiculous situations. And actually, we were not getting the workforce that we need. And by doing things such as allowing asylum seekers to come into the country and having a completely ridiculous home office which didn't process things quickly enough and not allow them to work, not allow them to contribute to the economy, we were wasting more money. So we had policy to allow asylum seekers to work in this country after they were here for 6 months. And that is, you know, it's our duty to support them as people who are fleeing particular circumstances, but a lot of people have come here to rebuild their lives. Preventing them from working doesn't help them or their families. And doing away with things such as, so if you are a child that is born here to somebody who was not born here and is currently on a particular type of visa, that does not automatically make you British. You are asked to pay up to £1,000 and pass a good character test, which I don't understand how a 10-year-old could do. Is it about not stealing cola bottles from the corner shop? I have absolutely no idea. What is it? No detentions? All of these ridiculous things that are put in place to prevent children who are born here from being able to access their rights as citizens. And I know that I have I'm a governor at a school, and a lot of the young kids at the school were talking about how, you know, they're picking their GCSE options, they're thinking about going to university, but they may not have the opportunity to because they do not have British citizenship, despite being born here, despite being here from a young age, and unless their parents could find £1,000 to pay for their citizenship, they would not be allowed to access a university education at the same price as their other counterparts would in their class. And that is absolutely disgraceful. So we were going to do away with that. And I mention all of these policies now because I get really concerned. Obviously they were announced over a period of time, they're announced in a certain way, and it feels like you're already hearing some conversations that are shifting things. Now, if we are going to change Labour policy in certain areas, we need to tell people that we're changing Labour policy. We can't do it secretly. We didn't do it secretly when we announced this policy. And the one example that I can give is more recently, no recourse to public funds. So, you know, there was a lot of uproar about no recourse to public funds and the NHS surcharge. Now, the NHS surcharge and no recourse to public funds are both issues that people have raised, particularly in terms of healthcare workers, because they are the ones that are fighting COVID at the moment. And unfortunately, you know, Black communities are more likely to die from COVID. So they are on the front lines. And with the NHS surcharge, we said that we announced a policy as a party recently that we would remove the NHS surcharge for healthcare workers. Well, actually, it's already been announced that it is already the policy that we will remove the NHS surcharge for everybody. It's absolutely ridiculous that a national health service into which people pay. Now remember, a lot of people that are being made to pay this people that are being made to pay this NHS surcharge pay national insurance just like the rest of us. It's an extra charge. It's not clear where the money goes, and it creates massive issues. And ending that disgraceful policy of no recourse to public funds. So all of those things are already there, and we need to make a point to protect that. And just to finish, immigration detention centres. Now, I think the thing that signalled for me a complete kind of sea change in how we discuss immigration is my visit to Labour Party conference in 2010, and then my visit to Labour Party conference in 2019. Now, my visit to Labour Party conference in 2010 and the discussions around immigration were completely different, because by the time we got to 2019, you saw a whole conference get up on its feet and give a standing ovation, because we passed a policy that we would close immigration detention centres, and that for me was amazing. That for me is one of those markers as to how things had changed. Now, closing immigration detention centres, I think, is making sure that people are not detained for longer than 28 days is one of those amazing landmark policies. And I remember going with Diane to visit Yarlsbridge Immigration Detention Centre. It took well over a year for the Home Office to let us in, and when we did, what we saw there was absolutely disgraceful. And the worst thing is that, you know, private companies are being given millions and millions of pounds. Private companies that have even been found to be defrauding the government, they're given millions and millions and millions of pounds to run these immigration detention centres. And these centres, do you know that after you count them all up, over 50% of the people they detained.
So Belle, we're going over time slightly, so end on this point. Great.
Yeah, over 50% of the people that that are in those immigration detention centres are eventually released into the community. That means the government is paying money, millions of pounds for people's misery for no good reason, and detaining people for months on end for no good reason, catching them and putting them in again. So, sorry, I've gone a bit over time, but I just want to end on immigration detention because of that Labour Party conference, and because of what that signalled to me, and because of how passionate I am about making sure that we do not start to roll back. We're about to end up in the worst economic recession that we have ever been in, and we know what happens then. We start to scapegoat migrants, but we should hold strong to those policies, remember that they exist, most importantly, and fight for them. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Belle. And I mean, your passion there just really shows. And just to end on that brilliant success at that conference, where we were actually, as you say, creating policies to close down these immigration detention centres, and just so to thank you so much for all the work that you have done to orchestrate the fight against the Tories in the way that you have done with Diane Abbott, and creating a more humane policies in terms of the home affairs. And just think what would have happened if we had won the elections in 2017. We would have a more humane Home Secretary, a more humane Home Office, and we would have had the brilliant Diane Abbott as our Home Secretary, and that would have been fantastic. I'm glad I did a brilliant introduction at the beginning for our next speaker, because I've run out of time to introduce him now, but only to say our next speaker, the Member of Parliament for Leeds East. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Claudia. And I really enjoyed listening to the contributions from Christine and from Belle. I think this is a fantastic event. So I want to talk really about the justice policies that I think need defending and advancing in this National Policy Forum context and beyond. But I also do want to say that the National Policy Forum itself, really, I do think needs changing at some point as soon as possible, because although lots of good people do great work as part of the National Policy Forum, making their submissions, and that's important, and working on the National Policy Forum, I think it was invented as a process by Tony Blair really to weaken the power of Labour Party conference. So I do think some democratic reform to our National Policy Forum process is required. But in relation to justice, I think that we can be proud of the justice policies that we developed in the last few years. And public ownership in justice and removing the profit motive is very important indeed. Not that some journalists and the scoffing Tories agreed with us, of course, but they were proven wrong on a number of occasions, most recently with the announcement just the other day about taking probation back into public ownership. We'd been arguing for an end to private prisons. We'd been arguing for an end to the disastrous privatisation of probation that Chris Grayling had been brought in. And some commentators, even on the nominal left, were saying that we were too obsessed with this idea of public sector good, private sector bad. On the contrary, we were facing and are facing a government which generally accepts the neoliberal mantra that it's private sector good, public sector bad. So I was proud that in our manifesto we committed to bringing probation back into public ownership, and I'm proud that we commissioned the very well-respected Lord Ramsbottom to do a report and a review into what a publicly owned probation service would look like under a Labour government. We also made it clear that no ifs, no buts, we believe that the incarceration of human beings for profit was and is immoral. And that's why we supported an end to PFI in prisons, no new private prisons being returned to the public sector, and also an end to those PFI contracts for prison maintenance. And when you look at our prisons, run, for example, by Sodexo, run, for example, by Serco, you can see it's the same companies that are making money from our public sector. So under the neoliberal model, in justice, as in all else, the state seems to exist to hand out contracts to big corporations. And we've seen, haven't we, as well, that Serco have been granted the test, track and trace contract by the government worth millions and millions of pounds. I do want to touch upon, of course, our policy in relation to widening access to justice. I was proud that we promised to reverse all the Tory cuts to legal aid for early legal help. And that meant bringing back early legal advice for immigration cases, for employment cases, for debt, for mental health cases, and more. We also promised to ensure legal aid for inquests into deaths in state custody and the preparation of judicial review cases. We also promised to establish a root and branch review of the legal aid agency. Crucially, we promised as well a golden era of law centres with a new fund to expand law centres so communities can actually get legal support to fight back against dodgy landlords and fight back against unscrupulous bosses. We also announced a new community lawyer initiative which would fund training contracts so hundreds of lawyers can serve their local areas. And there's a manifesto pledge as well to look at how to give every citizen a constitutional right to justice, because just as health and education should be the rights of every citizen, so a right to justice should be constitutional right of every citizen as well. As I say, we promised to kick the private sector out of our justice system. We promised to end the failing courts reform plans by halting all further court closures and bringing in £100 million emergency funding to help fix crumbling courts. And we also had a manifesto pledge to actually invest in problem-solving courts that tackle the actual root causes of offending. We also supported alternatives to custody, and I think this is very important. It's something that we can be very proud of, and it's something that we need to stick to. As Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, I announced at Labour conference that we would scrap ineffective short prison sentences by introducing a presumption against short prison sentences of less than 6 months for non-violent and non-sexual offences. I also announced we would have action to improve the use of community sentences and funding to plug that shameful gap in the government's funding for the female offender strategy, and that we would, importantly, invest in women's centres to reduce the number of women being jailed. And all these things are policies I think we can be proud of developing and advocating, and all these things are policies which we should defend and try to take further as well. We also address the issue of tackling discrimination in our justice system. A manifesto commitment was there to tackle the shocking overrepresentation of black and minority ethnic children in our youth prisons. More than 50% of the children locked up in our prison system are from black and minority ethnic communities. We have a worse disproportionality in terms of race in our prison system than even the United States of America. We also promised to establish a fully independent review into how our justice system is handling the crime of rape, because women deserve to be able to have confidence in our justice system. And just to be clear, by a full independent review, what I mean is a review of how the crime of rape is handled, right from the first complaint to the police and the authorities, right through to the release of convicted rapists and interactions with the parole board. Crucially, because we believe in justice for working people going forward, but also redressing historical injustices faced by the working class, we also promised action on historic injustices. So we promised to introduce the public accountability law that the brave Hillsborough and Grenfell families had called for, to force officials and private companies to come clean about wrongdoing. We also promised a release of all the papers on the Shrewsbury 24 trials and the 37 camel-led shipyard workers. And of course, a public inquiry into the historical injustice of Orgrave. It was 36 years yesterday since the police riot at Orgrave during the 1984 to 85 miners' strike. And we also promised a public inquiry into the blacklisting of trade unionists. We also supported the struggles of those fighting for justice, including a public inquiry for the family of Zane Bangbola. And all of these things are things we were proud to support. So what we can't have is a return to some of the approach to the justice system under New Labour, whether that be the increased use of private prisons, or whether that be chasing right-wing newspapers in terms of rhetoric on crime and law and order, which might look good on the front page of a right-wing newspaper, but doesn't actually make our communities safer. You know, we want to rehabilitate. We believe in rehabilitation. We believe in turning lives around. And we believe in reducing the number of victims of crime. And putting people in prison for super short sentences doesn't do that. So when it comes to widening access to justice, when it comes to supporting alternatives to custody, when it comes to creating safer prisons, when it comes to kicking the private sector out of our justice system, when it comes to ending the failing courts reform plans, when it comes to tackling discrimination in our justice system, and when it comes to action on historic injustices, we can be proud of the manifesto that together we helped to develop in 2017 and 2019. I think we need to go forward advocating and defending those policies, but also building upon them.
That is absolutely fantastic, Richard. Really there outlining and summing up very clearly why we are here today. We've got policies to defend. You know, what Belle and Richard have just outlined are actually some fantastic policies that we could have had if only we'd won the 2017 election, and if only we'd won in 2019. We could have had some brilliant policies, but we need to defend these policies now, and that's why we're holding this event this evening. We now need all members to really respond. We've got a moment or two for one or two questions, I think, and I'm hoping that Richard and Belle would and Christine may be able to just take one or two questions. We've got I've got a question. Richard, I don't know if you wanted to answer this challenging question. there's a question here from Mariam. Were there any policies, Richard, that you wanted to go into the manifesto but couldn't be included? And then a question from Nigel on the Royal Commission, and I think this one maybe for you, Belle, in terms of the Royal Commission on drugs. Basically asking, how do we get involved in the Royal Commission? What would that have looked like in terms of involvement? And it says that in a sense, the experts are those who have been affected by current drug policy. We need to hear from those who are impacted by drug policy. So what might that look like? And then I'll come back to a question for Christine, if I might. So do you want to just go with those for now, Richard and Belle?
Yeah, in terms of the question about was there anything I wanted to go in the manifesto that didn't? Well, not really. I think it was an ambitious Justice manifesto, but that's not to say that would have been the end of it, because obviously in government we'd have tried to take it further, would have listened to members, listened to stakeholders, listened to the diverse communities that we represent, and taking it further and built upon that. But as to whether there are actually any specific policies that I tried to get into the manifesto that didn't make it in there, the answer is no.
Brilliant. Belle?
In terms of a Royal Commission, they actually form the type of public inquiry, let's say, but it's one that's based on evidence. So as well as asking, service providers and people that are involved, you're looking at bodies that provide the real evidence, and far too often the government's own advisors have advised that we need reform on drugs legislation, and they just aren't taking it forward. I think, again, for political reasons, which is why we thought it was important to have something which steps outside of Parliament, makes all of those recommendations, and then a commitment from us to implement them. So I do absolutely think that it would have involved, again, as I said, people that have been affected from a social justice issue, but people who have been affected in a public health way in terms of addiction and being in a situation where they've found themselves unable to access resources to help them with drugs. So yes, absolutely, it would have involved everybody, but most importantly, it would be based on evidence, not ideology, and wouldn't be, and again, with our program of investing in our public services, wouldn't be one that's based on cuts, just cutting things in places where we know they're very, very detrimental.
Brilliant, thanks. Could I just bring Christine, could I just ask you to look at this question, which I thought was quite interesting. The question relates to primary education and secondary schools, and whether or not we should give a greater balance to primary education over secondary. And then there was an interesting question about how we teach about trade unionism in our schools. So I don't know if Christine is still with us, able to look at those. If not,
she's there. Yeah,
I am. Yep, I am able to look at those. Thanks very much, Claudia. I'm not entirely sure what we mean by balance between primary and secondary. I mean, clearly secondary schools get more money, but they're bigger. So one of the things is that we do tend to assume I was a secondary teacher first, and then I was a primary teacher. When I was a secondary teacher, I thought we had to, they came to us like empty vessels. I don't know what I thought they'd been doing in the primary school, but I just thought, we in the secondary school, we were doing the serious job. And nothing can be further from the truth, actually. The really, really, really hard work in teaching is in the primary phase. So certainly we ought to talk up what gets done in primary schools. And if anything, they probably need at least as much money as secondary schools, if not more. But the other thing I am passionately interested in is teaching about trade unions in school. You won't be surprised to know that my own two daughters always asked all their teachers which union they were in. And anyone who had the temerity to say they weren't in a union, my kids used to go in with an application form for the NUT for them the very following day. As it happens, the TUC has some very, very good materials actually for teaching about trade unions, but very few teachers access them, and very few schools find space in their personal health and social education to teach about trade unions. But it can be done. It's a matter of will. It's not excluded by the national curriculum. It can be done in PHSE. And maybe what we need is individual union members, but also the TUC talking to schools. I mean, you know, there are lots of trade union members who are governors, who are parents, who could be saying, you know, it's quite interesting. My children don't seem to learn anything about trade unionism in school. I've visited schools every year just before Tolpuddle, and talked about the fact that it's the Tolpuddle Festival coming up, you know, why we have trade unions, what they do. So even in an assembly, there's a lot that you can do, but you won't get any pushback from me. We ought to be doing a lot more of it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Christine. And I think I've just got one final question, I think, that we can take probably, and that is an all-rounded question, I think, which really reaches out to both members of parliament who are part of the Socialist Campaign Group and what we do at the grassroots as well. But the question is basically asking, what can the Socialist Campaign Group members of parliament do to defend the policies that were developed under Jeremy Corbyn, and what can grassroots members do to get involved? And of course, it is a self-fulfilling proposal, because we're here trying to get involved to defend these policies. But I don't know if Richard, Bell, do you want to come in on finally addressing those questions?
Yeah. Is it okay if I go first?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing to do for left members is not to leave. I see on Twitter various left-wing members saying they're leaving. I understand when left members get disappointed that the left candidate for leader and the left candidate for deputy leader didn't win. I understand when they get heartbroken when they see that leaked report and all the allegations in it. However, what people have got to remember is there was a time when the left never won internal elections. And so I think it's easier for people who joined since 2015 to get too disheartened. Actually, the left and left policies are in a far better position now than they were in the party back in 2015. And people should remember, if it wasn't for left-wing members staying in the party, even in the aftermath of the Iraq War, then there wouldn't have been sufficient left members to get candidates on the left selected who then became MPs. And if those candidates on the left didn't get selected and then didn't become MPs, there wouldn't have been sufficient MPs to get Jeremy on the ballot paper in the first place. So there wouldn't have been a left-led Labour Party for so many fantastic left new members to join. So they need to remember that. I think they also need to remember that people in other countries, for having our politics and for no other reason, get put in prison, get tortured, even get killed. So I'm sure that we can manage to carry on arguing and developing left policies if our comrades in other countries can manage to put up with those experiences. And I'm sure even in the aftermath of this devastating election defeat on the 12th of December, we can carry on. And we also need to understand that left policies are going to become more and more necessary in the economic crisis that's on the way. As Bell mentioned, the economic crisis that's on its way is likely to be comparable to the 1930s depression. It's going to be far more severe, unfortunately, according to many experts, than the banking crisis. So in that context, socialist policies of public ownership and socialist policies of state intervention on the side of the 99% will become more and more important, more and more necessary. I think there'll be more and more of an appetite for it, because those kind of policies will be answering the very real problems that sadly our communities are going to be facing. And so keep on being involved, encourage your friends not to leave, and let's ensure as well that in these National Executive Committee elections we have a unified slate on the left as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Richard. And Belle, I don't know if you want to just add anything there, because also there was, you know, some comments about particular groups of people that may be thinking about leaving. If you,
I mean, I know that a lot of people have been upset by the leaked report, particularly a lot of black communities. I've heard black people saying that they want to leave the party, but I do believe that the Labour Party is the home of black people. That doesn't mean that they should be taken for granted in any way, shape or form. And I think the policies that we formulated were very, very clear about that, very, very clear on defending those communities, because you know, it's about everybody. If we're discriminated against in any sort of way, I believe it affects everybody, and we should all be standing up against that. And I completely agree. You know, the slogan that we use throughout most of the time, for the many, has been really, really important. And I want to people to note that during the leadership elections, although people may not have said exactly what people wanted them to say in terms of policy, no one majorly departed from the policies that we had. They knew they had to play it in a certain way because that's where the membership was. And as long as the membership stay that way, I believe any leadership will remain under pressure to ensure that they maintain those policies, and making sure that we maintain the National Policy Forum and all the democracy that comes with it, and the democracy that comes with conference. If we can maintain that, if we can maintain people in the party that believe in these policies, at the end of the day, you know, the leadership will have to listen. So we shouldn't let up on that. As Richard said, we should stay, we should fight, and we should make sure that they're front and centre.
Brilliant. Thank you, Belle. Before we all close, I just want to give a big thanks to all of our excellent speakers for their insightful contributions. I want to thank you, the audience, for staying with us on a Friday night and giving this time because you want to see change. I would like to quickly finish by saying a few words about about some aspects of our discussions tonight, as this is something that I've been so impassioned about in recent weeks, in particular in relation to home affairs. As socialists, I believe it's vital, of course, that we take heed of the message that we've said tonight to ensure that we contribute to the extraordinary efforts of our frontline workers. And that means that we must continue to push for a permanent extension of migrant rights. That means an end to the hostile environment, shutting detention centres and granting indefinite leave to remain for all NHS workers, carers and frontline workers and their dependent families. These are the policies we need to push for. You know, recent reports indicate that migrant NHS workers and carers are still being charged as Bella's outlined, that in that terrible way for using services that they work in, despite the government's recent U-turn on the health surcharge. It hasn't happened, and we've got to continue to push for that. And of course, as Labour, we must ensure that the government stick to their promise to end this surcharge. Over the last few weeks, we have held discussions covering virtually all Labour's policy agendas, whether that's been our internationalism agenda, housing, local government, the economy, welfare, and so on. And today, of course, with education and with home affairs as well, justice and home affairs. We've kind of covered a wide range, but we've covered all of the commissions, and we've wanted to ensure that everybody has the opportunity really to hear the voices of us on the left, to remind us of the policies that we fought for, to never give up on those policies, to never believe that they weren't right, because that's not what the public is telling us. They were the right policies, and it's right for us to defend them. I think it's important for us to remember how far we've come as a party in the last 5 years. In 2015, we had a party that did not oppose austerity, capitulated to right-wing narratives on immigration, and did not offer a genuine alternative vision for a fairer society. And obviously the results of December were, of course, devastating, but we know that we don't have to accept the unjust status quo, that it is possible to fight against systems of oppression, and that together we can actually fight for real change. We can actually achieve real change if we remain together. That is why it's so important So important for Labour members to engage with the National Policy Forum to defend and expand this radical policy programme, because we know that only a bold member-led Labour Party will be able to deliver the sweeping changes that our society so desperately needs. So I implore you to all get involved, to tell everybody to get involved. We are going to put all of these discussions that we've had over the past 4 weeks, we're going to put them on the Cosmos website. We're going to get them out to people. We've got till the end of June to respond. We want everybody to engage in this process. We want to just thank everybody as well for all of their participation over the last 4 weeks, for your participation tonight. Thank you and good night.